वजह से शिवानी जी का यह आग्रह था कि लोग समझ बैठे हैं कि देर से ही होगा, इसलिए 2:30 बजे तक लोग आएंगे। हालांकि 2 बजे से शुरू करने की हैसियत में ये विकास जी, ऋषि जी, शिवानी जी सब थे, पर शुरू नहीं हुआ इसलिए कि पीछे ऐसा हो गया। आगे से ऐसा नहीं होगा, इसकी गारंटी आप सब लें। तो आज ये ज्ञान का कार्यक्रम जो भारतीय भाषा केंद्र के अनुवाद अध्ययन शाखा और भारत सरकार के संयुक्त तत्वावधान में ये कार्यक्रम अनुवाद और अंतर सांस्कृतिक संप्रेषण, इस विषय पर जो कार्यक्रम पिछले 4 दिनों, इसके 4 दिनों में 2-2 भाषण आप सबने सुने। मैं आशा करता हूं कि आप सब अनुवाद में प्रवेश आप सबका हो चुका होगा। वैसे कुछ लोग तो ऐसे भी हैं जो जीवन भर अनुवाद में घुसे रहते हैं पर अनुवाद में नहीं जा पाते, क्योंकि उनके लिए अनुवाद की सबसे बड़ी दुर्दशा तब से शुरू हुई है जब से अनुवाद से कमाई धमाई होने लगी है। मैं दुनिया के अन्य विद्वानों का नाम लेने के बजाय पूरी दुनिया में हर जगह ऐसे विद्वान हैं जिन्होंने अनुवाद को अपना कर्म नहीं समझा, अपना धर्म समझा। आप सब याद कीजिए, प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा मैम ने पहले दिन धर्म के बारे में 2-3 तरह की बातें की थी, और धर्म हर जगह वही नहीं होता जिसे सामान्य रूप से लोग धर्म समझते हैं। अनुवाद की भी वही दशा है। तो एक समय था कि अनुवाद में ये समझा जाता था अनुवाद के लिए कि दुनिया की किसी भाषा में ज्ञान उपजा है, तो यह ज्ञान उस भाषा में भी लोगों तक पहुंचना चाहिए जिस भाषा के लोग उस ज्ञान की भाषा को नहीं समझ रहे हैं। अभी हमारे नाम आपका केशव जी, ये इग्नू से कोई पाठ पढ़ रहे हैं। आप में से और भी कुछ लोग पढ़ रहे हैं इग्नू के बारे में। मैं खुद ही इग्नू से वाकिफ हूँ, इग्नू में कुछ दिन काम भी कर चुका हूँ। तो इग्नू के बारे में मेरी धारणा थी, जो धारणा प्रकाशन उद्योग, अब ये विडंबना ही है कि उन सभी चीज़ों में मैं काम कर चुका हूँ। मतलब पहले प्रकाशन उद्योग में काम किया, और प्रकाशन के बारे में मेरी धारणा यह है कि प्रकाशन ने मनुष्यों के ज्ञान तक पहुंचने के जो रास्ते हैं, उस रास्ते में जितनी दीवारें थी उसको प्रकाशन ने गिरा दिया। वो दीवारें टूट गई क्योंकि जो पहले बहुत सारे नीति वाक्य आप सब लोग पढ़ रहे हैं कि इस जाति को, इस लिंग के लोगों को, इस धर्म के लोगों को ये चीज़ें पढ़ने के लिए वर्जना थी, वे सारी वर्जनाएं प्रकाशन ने खत्म कर दिया। क्योंकि आप जब किताब की दुकान पर जाते हैं तो दुकानदार आपसे ये नहीं पूछते कि इस किताब को स्त्री पढ़ेगी या पुरुष पढ़ेगा, आप सवर्ण पढ़ेंगे या सवर्णेतर पढ़ेंगे, अंग्रेज पढ़ेंगे या भारतीय पढ़ेंगे, वो सब खत्म हो गया। इग्नू ने भी जो संपत्ति की दीवारें थी कि समृद्धशाली लोग ही केवल पढ़ सकते हैं, उसके पास पैसे हैं, तो इग्नू ने एक व्यवस्था दी कि आप घर बैठे भी पढ़ सकते हैं। तो ज्ञान के रास्ते में जो दीवारें थी उसको इग्नू का ओडीएल सिस्टम, दूर शिक्षा पद्धति ने खत्म किया। इससे बहुत पहले, जिसकी जानकारी हम में से बहुतों को नहीं थी, 20वीं शताब्दी के 6ठे दशक में, हम तो मानेंगे 7वां दशक, क्योंकि अंग्रेजों के लिए वह 60s होता है, मतलब 60s का मतलब हुआ 60 से 69, मगर भारतीय के लिए 61 से 70 ये हुआ, इसलिए वो 7वां दशक है। तो 7वें दशक के शुरुआत में इंग्लैंड, अमेरिका, जर्मनी इत्यादि में जिन दिनों तुलनात्मक साहित्य की पढ़ाई जहाँ कहीं होती थी या भाषा साहित्य का जहाँ कहीं अध्ययन होता था, वहाँ पर अनुवाद अध्ययन की पढ़ाई अलग से शुरू हुई। और भारत में भी उन्हीं दिनों 60-62 के बीच में डॉक्टर नगेंद्र की सदाशयता से दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय में अनुवाद अध्ययन की पढ़ाई छोटे छोटे कोर्स के रूप में शुरू हुई। ये सारी चीजें इस बात की गवाह है कि पूरी दुनिया में अनुवाद ने ज्ञान तक जनसामान्य की पहुंच को के लिए जो दीवारें थी उन सभी दीवारों को तोड़कर गिरा दिया और अब सारे लोग उस ज्ञान तक पहुंच सकते हैं। तो जिन दिनों ये था कि अनुवाद ने एक भाषा में उपजे ज्ञान को दूसरी भाषा में तक पहुंचाने की चेष्टा कर रहे थे, बाद के दिनों में, मेरा मतलब है कि जिसे हम मुगल काल कहते हैं, उसकी समाप्ति के बाद जब अंग्रेजों का शासन भारत में हुआ तो पहली बार अनुवाद पूरी दुनिया में शक की चीज हो गई, क्योंकि वे ट्रांसलेटेड कोट अनकोट, वे सही रूप में अनुवाद नहीं किया करते थे भारत पर शासन करने के लिए। एक अनुदित संस्करण आया करता था। उसके बाद से अनुवाद में द्वितीय विश्व युद्ध के बाद तरह तरह की शंकाएं होने लगी और अनुवाद का जब कूटनीति तक प्रसार हुआ तो ये सब सारी चीजें हैं। ऐसे में जब से अनुवाद से कुछ कुछ कमाई धमाई होने लगी है तो इसमें दादुर सब बख्ता भय हो गया। तुलसीदास को याद कीजिए कि सारे वे लोग जिनसे अनुवाद नहीं हो सकता वे लोग अनुवाद में कूद पड़े हैं और खोटे सिक्के सही सिक्के को बाजार से गायब कर देते हैं। और इस कारण यह हुआ कि बेहतर अनुवादकों को बेहतर मानदेय मिलना बंद हो गया, क्योंकि घटिया अनुवादकों की भरमार हो गई। कल एक मित्र ने हमारे गंगा जी से कुछ सवाल किया था इन्हीं सारे मसलों पर। तो ये इन सभी चीजों से दूर हटकर पिछले 4 दिनों से आज 5वां दिन है, आपने प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा मैम का हर दिन प्रायः एक लेक्चर हुआ है जिसमें अनुवाद के विभिन्न कोणों को आपने सुना है। और मुझे लगता है कि अब शायद आप लोग अनुवाद में प्रविष्ट हो गए हैं, वे भी जो यहाँ अनुवाद पढ़ रहे हैं, क्योंकि मन से वे भी अनुवाद में अभी तक सिचुएट नहीं हो पाए हैं। गंगा जी मुस्कुरा रहे हैं। आज फिर से एक नए विषय के साथ, आज का विषय है द कल्चरल टर्न, सांस्कृतिक मोड़ में। ये अनुवाद में सांस्कृतिक मोड़ कैसे कैसे उत्पन्न होते हैं और किस तरह से संस्कृति के कारण अनुवाद में समस्याएं खड़ी होती है, उन समस्याओं से अनुवादक को कैसे जूझना होता है। मैं कुछ सवालों से 4 दिनों से जो सवाल सुन रहा हूं अन्य 4 वक्ताओं से और लगातार प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा मैम से आप लोग जो सवाल पूछते हैं उसमें मुझे ये लगता है कि आप लोग सारी ही चीजों के लिए किसी न किसी विशेषज्ञ की राय की इच्छा करते हैं। वस्तुतः अनुवाद का काम एक युद्ध है जो वहां जब बैठते हैं तो विजयी भाव से बैठें कि इसमें हमें विजय ही प्राप्त करना है और उसके लिए हमें स्वयं लड़कर उस शब्द से, उस पदबंध से और उस संस्कृति से लड़कर कोई न कोई रास्ता निकालना है। अभिज्ञान शाकुंतलम के एक उदाहरण पर थोड़ा सा संकेत मैम ने किया आपको एक दिन के भाषण में। मुझे जब बोलना होगा मैं उस दिन उस पर विशेष रूप से चर्चा करूंगा, क्योंकि गंगा जी की सदाशयता से मैंने इनकी सह पाकर विकास जी ने मुझे सांस्कृतिक मामले को ही लेकर आदेश किया है कि मुझे उस पर बोलना है। अभी आप सब की तरफ से, भारतीय भाषा केंद्र की तरफ से, हम सब आयोजक मंडल की ओर से प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा मैम का आज के इस सत्र में एक बार फिर से स्वागत करते हैं और आप सबकी तालियों से इस स्वागत को पुष्ट करना चाहते हैं। अभी आप प्रोफेसर अलेसांद्रा मैम को सुने। मैम।
नमस्कार। मैं एक बात करनी चाहती हूँ कि यदि आपको कुछ पूछना है लेकिन अंग्रेजी भाषा में पूछने में थोड़ी सी दिक्कत हो तो आप हिंदी में पूछ लीजिए। मेरी हिंदी टूटी फूटी है, मैं शायद हिंदी में नहीं जवाब दे दूंगी, लेकिन अब हम मतलब कोई रास्ता हमको कोई रास्ता मिलेगा कि हम मतलब एक दूसरे को समझ सकेंगे। तो मुझे मालूम है कि मैं अंग्रेजी में बोलती हूँ तो हो सकता है कि आपको थोड़ी सी मतलब कठिनाई हो। यदि कोई कुछ स्पष्ट नहीं है तो ऐसा करके पूछ लीजिए, ठीक है? नहीं तो हर स्लाइड में मेरा ईमेल लिखा हुआ है, तो आप मुझे ईमेल भेज दीजिएगा और मैं आराम से सब कुछ जो मेरे बस में है मतलब मैं बता दूंगी, ठीक है? Okay. So we start today to discuss the cultural turn. We have already heard about culture and translation. What are some of the issues? What I want to show to you is some of the people who participated into this cultural turn and the ideas that they brought into translation studies. So some of them have already been mentioned. You have already heard their names. And so maybe I will just, add on something that has already been said. Like, for example, yesterday, Ganga ji was mentioning Lefebvre, and I will also talk about him because cultural studies is a discipline where there has all this interaction of ideas. And when we speak about the different theories, we don't have to think of something that is like separated from, just avoid any binary idea that, you are either or. Very often when we do research, we are both end, it's not either or. So of course, we discuss with other scholars, and sometimes, I remember once Harish Trivedi having a big discussion with Anthony Pym about something, and but it's normal. I mean, you don't have to agree on things. We don't have to agree on everything. We have to talk. Somebody was, I think, I heard that it's like, kya hai? Vad, Anuvad, Samvad. So you had Vad, Vivad, Samvad. Acha. But I think it was, okay, this was probably, I can't remember, sorry, but it was in some of the essays we can also retell it like Vivad, Anuvad, Samvad. We have this. So, okay, what are we going to talk about? Okay, cultural turn. So, the notion of translation as rewriting. And this is interesting if you think of what we said about Anuvad and, the fact that is that like, equivalence and rewriting texts and so on. Translation and gender, I would just, say a few words on that because Jyoti Chawla is coming and she's going to talk about that at length. And then I will introduce the post-colonial translation theory. And if we have time, I would like to say a few words about the English translation of a very famous novel by Gurdial Singh. And I don't know if we have time, but as usual, I mean, we will see. So let's start with the cultural turn. What is the cultural turning in translation studies? It's the shift towards cultural studies. So at the end of the 20th century, we have this development of cultural studies as a discipline, and this is something that intermingles also with translation. So André Lefebvre, he introduced the notion of translation as rewriting because he sees the tension, the ideological tension that surrounds the text. So, okay, we have text A, text B, but there is always something more, because in the passage from A to B, there are a lot of things that come into into the field, and so, okay, I'm sorry, this is something that I just made twice the same thing. So, in 1990, a very important book came out. It was an edited book by Susan Basnet and André Lefebvre, where the basic question was, how does culture influence and limit translation? Because culture can both be something that, enhances things, but also something that hinders, it can be, why is it like, is it, oh, okay, because if I have to be, okay. So, but before that, a little bit before that, Mary Snell Hornby had already introduced the notion of cultural turn in translation studies, because she spoke of translation not as translation of texts, but translation as a cultural polity. So it's culture politics. When we do translation, we are doing an action that is culture politics. So she was, for example, examining the image of the literature that is created by the canonization of literature. We have already, addressed this question, of how you, for example, create a canon. What do you select and what do you leave? What is the text that is suitable to the accepted idea, and what are the texts that instead are not to be put into the canon, so they are not to be translated, they are not to be propagated, because there is something wrong in that or not good enough. And so anthologies, commentaries, film adaptations, and translations. This is also, in the process of creating this field of translation, and of course, also the institutions. I mentioned the Sahitya Academy, the fact that the universities, all these are involved in the process. So André Lefebvre, he wrote a famous book, which is Rewriting and the Manipulation of Literary Fame. His theoretical links are with the manipulation school. That is the notion that, when you translate, you are manipulating text. Manipulation is not necessarily something good or wrong. Manipulate means, etymologically is like you take it to your hands and you do something. So it can be good or wrong. So we have to not to be judgmental. But it's important to know that there is a manipulation. And of course, when the manipulation includes power, different power levels, different ideologies, the fact that, for example, the reception of a text or the acceptance or rejection of a text can be manipulated. Because if somebody very powerful says that this text is very good, this translation is good, my audience will be influenced by that. So this is a sort of manipulation, you know. If this is said by my cousin who is nobody, maybe the audience will say, okay, who cares? But if there is power, then this is something that is important. So, rewriting literature means translating literature, and of course this doesn't mean that you have to modify the text or do major changes. According to Lefebvre, the very act of translation is a form of rewriting, because actually what does the translation do? He or she writes the text another time. So it is a rewriting. So there are different motivations for that. You know, I mean, when we think, you know, of rejection, consumption of these texts, and the motivations can be ideological, and of course we have to analyze what is the dominant ideology and what is the relationship between the text and the dominant ideology, or poetological motivations, which is what is poetology. It's like, you know, the fact that it's suitable for the accepted canon, what you think that literature should be. So, and these are two different levels, of course. So let's see an example. An example is the English translation of Omar Khayyam. I mean, Omar Khayyam, I think everybody knows, he was a Persian poet. He is very famous. And the English translator, or can we say rewriter, because actually his translation was a real rewriting of the Persian text. It came from somebody who regarded Persian culture as inferior to his own culture. So this is the ideological thing. And in order to improve the original, what does he do? He introduces some things that are accepted in the Western English canon, so that this poetry becomes better. But you see, I mean, this is at the poetological level. You are using, for example, certain kind of verses that are accepted in the English literary field. And he modifies the text in order to make it better, in order to improve it. So this is manipulation at both levels, ideological and poetological. Any problem with that? Clear enough? Okay. So let's see another example. I go back to Tagore. I don't have anything. I mean, it's good. They gave him the novel. He deserved it. Okay. I'm not saying that there is something wrong in that. I'm just seeing that, as we were talking about that, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, you know, that he translated himself. But while he was translating himself, he was mimicking, he was like imitating the dominant discourse. He changed the style of his poetry. Somebody was also pointing it out. I think I don't know, somebody from that area. I don't remember exactly, but you know, somebody said, okay, but the English version is much different from the Bengali version. You know, it's almost a different poetry. You know, but why did he do it? Because he was foreignizing. Why did he have this goal in his mind? Well, he wanted to introduce Indian culture to the West. So he wanted to foreignize in order to make it more acceptable. And for this, he was like domesticating, you know, the poetry so that the readers could accept it. Can you see the different levels of the process? And of course, the audience, at the same time, when they received this poetry, they are both foreignizing and domesticating, because they were connecting Tagore's poems to the English literary tradition. But they were also looking at the differences and looking at them in a foreignizing, like exoticizing way. So I remember that there was somebody asking, is it better to do this or that? It is very rare that somebody does only foreignizing, only domestication. I mean, these can be present at different levels, and this is a very good example of what can happen, you know. So he was manipulating the texts himself because of the goal that he had in mind. We always have to keep in mind that the translator is always aware of you know, who is the receiver of the translation, because we are translating for somebody. Maybe the translation is commissioned by an institution, so we are translating for this thing. Maybe it's commissioned by a publisher, so we are translating in order to sell the book. Maybe it's commissioned by a teacher, so you have to do a translation that is okay for the academic, for example, for a student, then you have to write something that shows that you know, and so on and so forth. So rewriting is a process, it's a basic process that, according to Lefebvre, is everywhere in translation, historiography, anthologization, criticism, and editing. So it's really like everything is a rewriting. And of course, translation is what we recognize immediately, you know, because when a translator makes a change, you know, who reads the text and knows the original will say, oh, but where is the equivalence, you know, all these kind of things. While if you read a book on history, maybe it's more complicated. You have to, I mean, it's a different level. So it's also very influential because this kind of manipulation of the text is the one that makes it acceptable or not acceptable. Let's say it's successful or not successful in another culture. And so makes this work, you know, beyond the culture of origin. And here is, you know, the cultural aspect. So let's see what is this big, you know, field that is that we have to consider when we think of translation. So we have two big circles. One is the professionals and one is the patronage. By professionals is, of course, translators, professional translators, teachers, reviewers, critics, you know, like us. Okay, we are professional. And then there are the patrons, and they are outside the literary field. I'm talking mainly of literary translation because this is what Lefebvre is talking about. So, and they are the centers of power. But also the smaller field has power. It's a different kind of power. So the patrons, they, of course, they will be able to promote or stop the production because maybe they give you or take out the money. So this, I mean, that you are doing a translation. They say, okay, I'm not paying for that any longer. You can decide I'm working for free, but otherwise you just stop working. And dissemination, because they organize book launches, you know, and I don't know, this kind of things, prizes, all these things. And they can be individuals. Mecenas is the famous Latin giver of money, you know. In Italian we say mecenate to say a patron. So you see it's the same thing. But it can also be Hitler, you know, one person who says, you do this, I pay, and you do it. So it can be groups of people like publishers or political parties or the Sahitya Academy institutions that can be like institutions like national academics or journals or the school, the educational system, the university. So you see, we are all into these things. And what is interesting is that, the group of the professionals has more power at the level of poetological intervention. The group of the patronage has more power at the level of the ideological, because they can really push so that what is produced is according to what they really want to promote, so, but this doesn't mean that the translation doesn't have that power. The translator has also that power, but generally they have more power, in one of these fields. So of course, I was giving you the example of what are the things that come that the patronage controls is, the form, conventions, beliefs that they want to promote or to stop. The economic component, as they are the ones who give you money. So money makes the world go round, and so royalties, fees, and so on. And also think of the status component. I put here the picture of a very famous bookshop. You think a bookshop, is this something that has power? Well, if you have heard of the Beat Generation, then you should know that the City Like Books was the place where, because Ferlinghetti was the one who really, was like the soul of the Beat Generation, and the poets were all, connected to this bookshop. It's a bookshop. It's not. When I think of, this is also power. You see. So and of course the status, because if you are connected to this bookshop, then you are recognized as part of something important. Think of Javier Prasad Vivedi and Saraswati. That was a journal, but it had a lot of status. It also didn't have much money because, as far as I know, it was not something. But, this is status, It's something that is the conformity to the expectation of the group or of, the patron. So we can have two kinds of patronage. One can be undifferentiated and the other one can be differentiated. If it's undifferentiated, this means that all the three components, ideological, economical, and status, they're all provided by the same group, the same person. Think of, an authoritarian state where everything is controlled by the state, and they want to maintain a stable system, so they will only promote translations that, we will talk about that, like the translation policy, for example, in China. It's very interesting if you read, this. We will do it in one of the next sessions. If these three things are not together, they are separated, they are not dependent on one another, then, of course, we can talk of differentiated patronage. And, for example, we can have the example of pulp fiction, a bestseller, an author that is really selling millions of books, and maybe he gets a lot of money out of that. But in the literary field, no way. Jasusi Sahitya. It was, I think in Hindi, these detective novels. I don't know, how do you translate it? Detective novels? Something like that. So, Jasusi is like, Upanyas, huh? Anyway, what is considered lower, but these people were selling much more than many authors that are, recognized as big authors in the established literary field. Is it clear? Okay. So, as I was telling before, patronage wields most power in the operation of ideology, while the professionals have more most influence in determining the poetics. And as for the poetics, of course, what do we mean? It's all the literary devices and the role of literature. So this is important because Lefebvre stresses the fact that institutions have a lot of power in, trying to enforce the dominant poetic. And that's why, for example, I take the example of what was like Dalit literature, Adivasi literature in the beginning. It was not recognized as part of Sahitya. It was not real Sahitya. They don't write well enough. Why? Because their poetics are different. They are not the same as the ones that are recognized in the established literary field. So of course, this means that, somebody was also talking about that, the fact that the creation of the canon is something that happens by a process of selection, and some authors can be recognized very soon. They are pushed, they are immediately hailed as masterpieces and classics in the literature, and then maybe 50 years later nobody knows about them. This happens because of this kind of process. Maybe you remember that I mentioned Itamar Ibn Zohar, the Tel Aviv school. Somebody remembers about that? I remember that I mentioned him in the first class. So he's important because he elaborated this theory, that is the polysystem theory, that started as a theory of literature but then extended to translation studies. And what does he mean as polysystem? He says it is the entire network of interrelated systems. So all the systems that I mentioned, the professionals, institutions, publishers, all these different systems, they are interrelated, and of course it's literary and non-literary systems. And this polysystem is used to explain both canonical and not canonical literary works. Why is this connected to translation? Because maybe if you know where Tel Aviv is, I said the Tel Aviv school, so it's in Israel, So he was discussing Hebrew literature. And then he found out that in Hebrew literature, translations from Russian and Yiddish literature have a huge role. So what happens? We generally think of translated literature as something that is secondary. We don't include it in the canon. We don't think of that as something that we have to analyze. But he says we have to look at the polysystem. The polysystem is all this, it's like a network. And in this network, translation is very important because translated literature is really like the product of this interaction between multi-layered systems. Any question? It's okay? Stop me if it's not clear enough. And of course, if you think of what happened, for example, we were talking about, the building up the canon of Hindi and Urdu. I'm always going back to this because but I'm sure that you can have other examples from other languages, When you standardize the language, when you create the literary canon and you promote translations, you are really including or excluding. And so in the policy system, you can see how this process of inclusion and exclusion is connected to power, culture, and even, the linguistic factor has a lot to do with this, because we have said that the language is standardized, but through a selection of this within the linguistic continuum that we have, and we pass from a multilingual situation to a monolingual situation. We will talk about heterogloxia and homogloxia, but we will come to this in a few minutes, okay? So, just to give you an example, what happens in translation? Anybody knows what's Anna Frank's diary? Okay, so because I tried to choose, pick up things that I suppose everybody, at least, maybe you don't have not read it, but you know what it is about. So we have the Dutch edition that was rewritten actually, because it's not, it was edited, okay, by her father. And this, interestingly enough, is a rewriting of the text that omits some parts, and especially parts that are connected to Anna's sexuality, or some comments that probably the father thought are not good for relatives or family members, friends, and so on. And then we have the German edition, which is a little bit later, that omits some things. But here the omissions are different. They are omissions of, for example, remarks offensive to Germans. And there are also some misunderstandings in some parts. I give you this example. I cannot read Dutch, but the English translation of this sentence is, there is no greater enmity in the world than that between Germans and Jews. In the German translation, it's there is no greater enmity in the world than that between these Germans and the Jews. Why did the German translator need to make Germans become these Germans? Because with this, you only add an adjective, it's only one word. But the perception for the reader is that it is not said regarding all Germans. It's only the bad guys, these kind of people. So you see, this is a very small intervention, but it's manipulating the text, and it is rewriting, even if the translation is okay. So now we address the issue of translation and gender. And why do we need to do it? Well, we have mentioned power. I gave you the example of an autocratic state, but power is also in other elements of our lives. And being a woman, I know that a woman who grows up in a patriarchal society, the power play is always very much present. So Sherry Simon is our reference. In 1996, she wrote Gender in Translation, Cultural Identity and the Politics of Transmission. Of course, this trend is again linked to the cultural turn, because the fact that gender is something interesting that has to be analyzed and so on is linked to the feminist critique. And feminist critique, well, it doesn't necessarily have to do only with women, but it's like this analysis of the power relations in any kind of interaction. So it's, you can also apply to not only to women, it's any kind of majority and minority and so on. So Sherry Simon says, well, translation studies has done a lot of work, because we saw, they started many years ago, and there were, we are now in the third generation. This is the third generation that I mentioned. So it's like, okay, she recognizes that, there is a lineage, okay, the people who came before, they had very interesting ideas, but they failed in, taking into account what culture is. They take culture for granted. And, for example, Lefebvre himself, when he speaks of culture, he thinks that culture is the environment of a literary system. Okay. But this is like, okay, culture is something that is there and everybody knows what it is, and it's like something that is not problematic. For Sherry Simon, instead, culture is very much problematic, and so she says we should analyze this. And in culture, what I am interested in, she says, it's the fact that there has been an erasure of all the participation of women translators, for example, in cultural and political events, even if they have always been there, but they are like ghosts. So they are there, but you don't see them. And why is it? Well, it's the same story. There have always been women writers, but they are not in any canon. There have always been women doing things, but they are nowhere to be seen. This is patriarchal, And just to give you an example of this, ghostification of women, I remember, if you maybe is anybody of you familiar with the Om Prakash Valmiki's autobiography? I think it's very famous. Jutan. So, this is a totally masculine autobiography. I mean, where are women? If you read some passages, there are people, he describes, somebody comes, we sit, and so, and then Chai appears. Chai is like, just appearing by itself. There is nobody to mention of who is preparing this chai. I mean, there must have been some woman, boiling the water and coming and bringing the chai and giving the chai to them. But it's not registered. It's invisible. So that's why, when we speak of the translators' invisibility, I mean, women's invisibility is very much there.
Like yes, Lakshmi Ambai, they have mentioned in their stories like Squirrel. I don't remember the Tamil title, but in English it has been translated as Squirrel. And there is Virginia Woolf with A Room of One's Own, where she has this section called Shakespeare's Sister.
Yeah.
If Shakespeare had a sister, what would have happened?
Yeah, but we're not talking of if. We're talking of the women who were really there. They have always been there, but they're just, like ghosts. They are here with us, but we don't see them. Okay? So, and Sherry Simon talks about this. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time because, this gender and translation will be, the topic of the next class. But, of course, the language of sexism in translation studies is very much, and Sherry, she does a very good job at, analyzing how the language is full of violence and of masculine metaphors. And she quotes, for example, After Babel, the first book that was important because After Babel was like the path-breaking book for translation studies. Their translation is defined as appropriative penetration. So, and think of it's always a language of dominance. Think of the thing that, it's always said that you have to be faithful to the text, or you can betray the text, like women, like a good wife, like a bad wife, and why do we have to use this kind of metaphors? Nobody mentions men who are unfaithful. Nobody mentions you have to be faithful like a good husband. Oh, come on. No, it's always the wife who has to be faithful. But this is, you know, the sexism in language. And it's something, I know many people think it's something we should not care about, but I think it's really very important. Because, I mean, like Hindi, Italian has genders in the language. And so the fact that you use masculine as a neutral, I mean, some people say, okay, it's always been like that. Yes, but why? Does it always have to be like that? And do we all have to be men? I am not a man. I am a human being somehow, but not a man. But why man is generally used for, say, humans? In Italian, that is what happens, you know? So the feminist theory of translation is a project of engagement. You know, it's like translation is not neutral. Translation is something where we don't have to be invisible. We have to do things that make our readers think. And, for example, Simon says, for feminist translation, fidelity is to be directed towards neither the author, not the reader, but towards the writing project. A project in which both writer and translator participate. So the translator is part, or it's a relation. And, okay. So the feminist translator does not hide her manipulation of the text. She shows it, you know. She really flaunts the sign of her intervention. And translation is a political activity. A political activity that makes the language speak for women, because the aim is to make the feminine visible in language. And for example, here I wrote some examples between English and French. I'm not delving into that, but I mean, you can have an idea, you know, just, you know, translating one with a bold E, so that you see that it's one, but it's not one masculine, it's one feminine. Do you remember what happened with the translation from Dutch into German? That Dutch doesn't mark if it's masculine or feminine, and so the German translator of the Italian poetry, of the Italian poem, he chose the masculine. So if we mark that, then even in languages they don't have this in grammar. So, of course, yeah, we have to revalue the contribution that women translators have made to translations throughout history. And then there is also not, I mean, gender is not only, you know, women. We have the notion of queer translation. And Keith Harvey wrote Translating Camp Talk, that is an essay where he examines the homosexual discourse. And you know what is camp? Anybody has the idea of what is camp? It's a language practice and a stylish practice that is used in gay and also lesbian, but also particularly gay circles. That, you know, they use a special way of talking, special expressions, and they refer to special images and metaphors and so on. So, and, you know, it's like the fact of, you know, putting a lot of polite interjection into the speech, you know, and mixing formal and informal register. So there is somebody who has analyzed how this is maintained or cancelled in translation, because you can decide to just put everything in the standard language. You are translating. But I told you, the standard language is like, you know, homogenizing things. So this is another level of the story. So I'll just, you know, go on, because I want to just make a step ahead and talk about what is post-colonial translation theory. Okay, post-colonial, we could make a PhD, you know, trying to define what is post-colonial. Should we hyphenize it? Should we not hyphenize it? but I write it not non-hyphenized, and let's say that post-colonialism in this case is the study of the history of the former colonies, of European empires, because post-colonial is not only the colony, is also the European empires, the resistance to the empires, and the imbalance of power between colonizers and colonized. And in this context, if we think of translation, cultural studies brings into translation the notion of how complex is, this power between gender and culture, and, post-colonialism, post-modernism, post-structuralism, all this, is something that is debated. A very important scholar in this field of post-colonial studies is Tejaswini Niranjana. She wrote in 1992. So you see, we are in the 90s. We are talking about something that happened between the 90s and the end of the century. Citing translation, history, post-structuralism, and the colonial context. So she identifies translation as the site where the conflict of cultures and languages is most clearly manifested. And she, of course, stresses that there is this asymmetry of power and of the presence of colonialism. And she analyzes the role of this in many different fields, and literary translation is very much part of that. But not only translation, you see, there is education, there is historiography, there is philosophy, and, theology. So you see that when we think of culture, we have to become very much interdisciplinary. She says that translation studies have always been too much Western oriented, and for example, in translation studies with no post-colonial approach, the imbalance between different languages has been not considered, and the notion of text, author, and meaning rely on a theory of language, as we said, that is too simple, this linguistic approach. So she's one of the people who really criticize this. And so translation in the colonial context has to be analyzed as something that builds an image of colonial domination into the discourse of Western philosophy. So she proceeds to the decolonization of translation through a call for action, and we will see that there are many people who think of translation as something that is very active. It's an action. We saw for feminists, it's really, you show what you are, you speak out. So she decides to translate, avoiding all the Western philosophical and metaphysical representation, and she takes out and she deconstructs what the Western approach uses in order to marginalize the otherness that is of the West itself. So we have a translator that intervenes in the text very much, and for example, she translates some vachanas from southern India, some poems, these are mystical poems, and she criticizes the previous translation, even the accepted ones, like Ramanuja's ones, because she says that these kind of translations tried to assimilate the Shaivit poetry into the discourse of Christianity, She wants instead to make it clear that this is another tradition, something totally different. And for example, instead of translation, of putting God with the capital letter God, she restores the name of the poet's god, Guheshwara, and the linga as a representation of light, that in the previous translation had been like cancelled. You know, it has been made into something different. And then, of course, we have the queen of post-colonial theory, that is Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. She wrote a very famous essay, The Politics of Translation, and she brings together post-structuralism, feminism, post-colonialism, and she speaks of the translatese. What is translatese? Is the language of translation. Like you say, I don't know. But because she says that when we translate, we are not using real languages, we are using the translatese. That is this language that eliminates the identity of individuals and cultures that are politically less powerful and leads to a standardization of every different voice. So you see, this process of standardization is very much problematic. So she says, you know, this makes the literature of a woman in Palestine begin to resemble in the feel of its prose something by a man in Taiwan. You know, it's something other, you know, it's like a flat other. And she, of course, is also critical of Western feminism, Western publishing, because we will come back to the politics of translation tomorrow. So we will come back to this notion that there is the prominence of English and other hegemonic languages of the ex-colonizer, and there is the rest, you know. So she is translating from Bengali, but, you know, if the translator over-assimilates, then we don't have, in order to make it accessible to the Western readers, something like, you know, what Tagore had done. This is really like, you know, the politics of translation and writing in translatese. She was a translator. I mean, her major work is a translation. She became very famous because she translated into English a work of philosophy, you know, Derrida's De la Grammatologie, and she also translated Ramprasad Sen's songs, and she says, this is the quote that was made in some of the lectures, you know, I put it because it's translation is the most intimate act of reading. I surrender to the text when I translate. The songs sung day after day in family chorus before clear memory began have a peculiar intimacy for me. Reading and surrendering takes on new meanings in such a case. The translator earns permission to transgress from the trace of the other before memory in the closest places of the self. So you see, when you translate, you are also using something that is even before you started using the language. You know, you are referring to something that is even like prelingual. And so if the translation must surrender to the text, then the translation exposes the complexities of cultural exchange. And, you know, this translator is not the host nor the receiving culture. He or she, you know, is not subsumed by the host or receiving culture. And the translator has no home because there is no place. The translated work comes from this, you know, interior work. So, okay, I will just skip this and this also. So, the translation must be able to discriminate on the terrain of the original. So, we have to be aware of what were the subtle nuances in the original text, and then, you know, make it our intimate friend, you know, and then start translating. How does she translate? She said that first I translated speed. if I stop to think about what is happening to the English, if I assume an audience, if I take the intending subject as more than a springboard, I cannot jump in, I cannot surrender. So my relationship with Devi is Mahashweta Devi is easygoing. I am able to say to her, I surrender to you in your writing, not you as intending subject. Okay, so she is like, you know, writing very fast. She's not thinking of what is the audience she's, and then she revises. And when she revises, she tries not to do it having the audience in her mind. And this is exactly the opposite that I said at the starting of this talk. You know, I said when we translate, we always have in mind who is going to read it, who is going to receive. Spivak says, this is not what I do. If you want to translate according to, you know, Spivak's ideas, you don't have to do it. And she's really trying to revise in the name, by the protocols of the thing in front of me, in a sort of English. It's a sort of English. She doesn't have rules, you know, she doesn't have this clear-cut thing. So yeah, she translated Mahashweta Devi. I don't have to spend too much time on that. Everybody knows about Mahashweta Devi, and you know the fact that when these three short stories, it was a few short stories, they were translated into English by Spivak, then Mahashweta Devi became very famous all over the world. And it started being translated in all the languages of the world. Even if she had been a great writer for all her life, but nobody had ever heard of her. So, and then, you know, another point that I want to do, and here is where Harish Trivedi comes into the field, is that, you know, according to post-colonial translation theory, because of what we said, you know, this discussing power, gender, the different layers of the text, then translation is a battlefield. So translation is really something where one has to get into action. And it's a struggle. And of course, if we are talking about post-colonial, then in India this will be English. In other contexts, it will be like French or Dutch or German or whatever, okay? So I will just go fast into another thing, because I wanted to talk about also, okay, let me just quote GIAN Devi, who says that Indian literary traditions are essentially traditions of translation. So, and Devi is very much, you know, in this, he's very, like, you know, engaged in bringing back something that was forgotten, you know, because he's talking about the amnesia. And so he says, and he's saying, look, our whole history of literature is a history of translations. But we discussed about the presence of translation that is not the translation that is Jacobson translation. Do you remember that? So you see how all these things, it's like a puzzle, you know, you put everything together and you start seeing, you know, that there is, and by the way, just to remind you that this is not only in Asia or Africa. When we speak of post-colonial world, we have to think also of colonialism, because we're talking about empires, and Ireland, for example, was part of the empire. Ireland has been colonized by Britain, and the language was banned at a certain point. People could not speak Irish, you know, Gaelic, you know, so they could not speak this language. So there is also what is called internal colonialism, you know, within the world that we perceive as Anglophone, you know, a world that speaks English. But there are some areas that have been colonized. And for example, Michael Cronin, he is from Ireland, and he was really discussing these things in, for example, the Irish context. Yes, did you have a question? No. Yeah, of course. I'm just, giving examples. So, even today, translation is an issue, a political issue in Ireland. And so we have, this relationship between Gaelic and writing in Gaelic, writing in English. So, of course, we know that there are, for example, important Irish writers who chose to write in English. Can you mention one? Yeats or Joyce? Can you think Joyce? But think of the use of language that Joyce does, So I mean, you see that it's a different kind of English, So just to sum up, the scholars that promoted what is called the cultural turn, they are different. They had different approaches, but they all wanted to examine the ideologies and the motivation that are behind the act of translating. And the merit of the cultural turn, of this set of scholars is really that they gave new insights. They broadened the horizons, because translation is itself a political act. But what has to be kept in mind is that it is a political act even if it is expressed by a minority culture. So this culture, even within minority cultures, these two big circles are there. So who is promoting, okay, let's talk about minority culture, like, for example, Santali literature. I think, Santali literature is not hegemonic. It is a minority culture because in India they are a minority. They are scattered here and there. It's not, not all Santalis are the same, because we know that Santali communities, somewhere they are scheduled, somewhere they are not scheduled, somewhere, it's different. But they're all Santalis. So even within this minority culture, there is this, power play and all these things. So we as translators should be aware of that, and what the cultural turn critics, the people who are like scholars, they are suggesting is that, okay, be aware. You have to know that this is going on, and then of course you make your choice. So what should the translator do? This approach exposes the manipulations. Manipulations could be symptomatic of a conscious ideology. The translator consciously, like we saw that happens with the English translation from Persian, Omar Khayyam, or it can be the result of conditioning, because you have, for example, a publishing house, an editor, a government, who is creating a translating environment that pushes you to do some things. There is censorship, and censorship can also be self-censorship. And this cultural turn pointed out disparity between languages, in particularly referring to English. And this, we can open another chapter if we think of what is going on with English now as a global language. It's no longer something related to the British Empire. There is another kind of colonization, question mark. And so, all these things. So I think I will just keep the case study because I want to give some time to the questions. And then if we have maybe 5 minutes, we come back to this, okay? So, yeah, let's open the floor and see if you have curiosities or something that was not clear or any kind of reaction. Yes.
So power and ideology are the factors that govern the reception or rejection of any literary text or any translated text. So are there any ways that these manipulations can be removed? And is it always that these manipulations or does not embellish the text in any way? I mean, there can be some unconscious prejudices that can come. These manipulations can be unconscious. Yeah. So how can we remove them?
Well, okay. So first of all, the fact that you manipulate a text consciously means that you have a goal, and not necessarily this, as I told you, it's not necessarily something bad, because when I was introducing the feminist critique, here we have a conscious manipulation that has the goal of, making, for example, the presence of the female translator visible. So this is manipulation, but I mean, it's not made with hiding the goal. You are like showing your goal. So, and as for the unconscious things, okay, this is why we should always be aware of what we are doing when we make choices as translators. Because, for example, okay, here I have a feminist approach to my research, so I always position myself. I am a woman, I am a white woman coming from Southern Europe, Italy, and I will not tell you my age, but I am not 20 years old. So I am positioning myself. So I am conscious of, all the biases that I may have. I have biases, as anybody has, but having biases is not a problem in itself. The problem is that when you don't accept that this is a bias. So as a translator, for example, I wrote something, okay, when I was translating, for example, Jacinta Querqueta's poems, of course, I was translating from Hindi into Italian. And I was translating a young Adivasi poet being an Italian woman. So, of course, I had the problem of, what are you doing? You are not an Adivasi. What do you know? So, first of all, you should have the humility of accepting that you don't know everything. And so ask other people. Some translators don't like to say, I don't know. It's like, there are people who always claim that they know everything. And especially in the academic world, this happens very, very often, But I think, this is what Umberto Eco always said, The first thing you have to get to do is to have a humility in your approach. And being humble means that you don't claim that you know everything. And that, for example, I always say, I don't have answers. I can answer to your question, but it's not the answer. Somebody will come and they will have different opinions. Okay, so what? There are different opinions. We don't have to agree on everything. Then when you make your choice, you have to be able to motivate it, to argue for your choice. And this means that sometimes, I will talk about my experience in translating a very famous novel. And, it's sometimes I came up with something and the final result was I was not happy with that. But this was the best I could do. So, of course, if you try, you know, to get this mindfulness of your of your job, you know, what you are doing, then you will never be able to remove your unconscious motivations. I mean, these are there, but you don't have to go into psychology. I mean, I don't think you have to get a therapy in order to translate. Well, maybe some people should do it, but, you know, some other, generally, you know, it's like the most important thing is that you know that this is going on. When you are aware that all these things are playing into your translating this text, then of course that's why it's cultural. It's no longer a text to text. Because, and then I think, of course, the problem is that the final choice is always the translator's choice. And the translator, maybe, I mean, he or she will make a choice because of external problems. Like, you know, you have the publisher that says, you have to give me your translation by tomorrow. Then you work all night long, you drink a lot of tea or coffee or, you know, other drugs, whatever you want in order to do your thing, and then you do it. So, I mean, okay, this is a situation. Another situation is that you are a very rich person, you don't have to earn your money, so you can avoid being paid, and so you can just sit there for 30 years, and then you do your translation. But maybe you will have other kind of problems, you know. I don't know. So I hope okay.
Can we view recent award-winning translations as an act of exoticizing Indian literature for Western readers?
What do you mean? I mean, not all the winning...
recent means like you mentioned manipulating text. So I wonder if it can be done, you know, yeah, or making the text, you know, fluent for Western readers or attractive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, manipulation is, you know, you handle it, so it's somehow. But if you give a prize to a text, you may be manipulating it because you are promoting it. So if you are giving the prize to a special text and you are not giving it to another text because you want to push to promote the first one and not the other one, of course this is manipulation. But prizes are not something bad in themselves, I think. I don't know. I sort of perceived like a negative connotation in your idea of giving prizes to... Because why should, you know, giving an award to a novel being something that exoticizes it? Why?
Not always, but maybe sometimes it may be
happens,
possible.
yeah. But not all the awarded novels are you're only talking about novels or coming from India or from...
It's like just I wonder.
Okay,
if,
but I can. Okay, wait a minute, because I can give you yes, maybe yes, but it doesn't only. Okay, yes, okay. Prize, the prize system is a manipulative system, but more or less all systems are manipulative. It doesn't work only for, I mean, this manipulation does not only exoticize India or former colonies. And I give you an example. I know you studied Italian, didn't you? Yeah, okay. So, Elena Ferrante. Elena Ferrante is considered the great living writer in Italian today. And she is a woman. The woman is the name is of a woman, but nobody has ever met her, so it might be a woman, a man, a dog. We don't know. It's Elena Ferrante. Elena Ferrante is considered the best ever writer now in Italy. Okay, I read the trilogy, I read all of that, and I must confess that I think it is really overrated, but this is my personal idea. When did Elena Ferrante become so important? When she was translated, he or she, well, she, let's call she because it's Elena, she was translated into English. So look, same thing. And, everybody got crazy about Elena Ferrante. Why is Elena Ferrante so good? Because she writes about Naples, about a certain kind of quarter of Naples. She caters to the taste of Anglophone readers. If you think of Italy, what is Italy? It's spaghetti, songs, Naples, sun. I don't know in India what is Italy for you, but the stereotype is like that. So in Elena Ferrante, there is not only that, but there are all these things. So you see, this exoticism is not only for India, it's everywhere. So, but should we think that all prizes are given only in order to exoticize? Oh, this is something I'll have to think about. I never thought about that, but I don't know, because if I think of Olga Tokarczuk, I don't know if she has been, I love her very much. I mean, I love her poetry, and I don't know if she has been so exoticized. So, but manipulation is everywhere, in every system, we are always manipulating, any interaction. But this doesn't have to be bad, So, I'm sorry, I don't know. I will think about that. We have to study the system of, prize giving for books.
बहुत सारे काम है करने के लिए।
हाँ,
इस पर क्यों काम इस पर क्यों सोच कर अपना समय खराब कर ये कोई हो रहा है।
ये तो बहुत दिलचस्प की बात है, क्योंकि मैंने कुछ साल पहले एक थोड़ा सा रीडिंग किया, जब इंडिया को, this was in 2000 I think, when India became the place where all Miss World, Miss, all the misses came from India, 90s, yeah. So it was, and look at that, it was exactly when the economic turn came in India. I think, and then I found literature, I started thinking about that, and I found literature, and so, this is very important. The system of the Miss, I don't know, of this beauty contests is linked to capitalism, neo-capitalism. It's so much connected. And so, okay, I'm not going into this. So I think it's important to think about things that apparently are so, far from what we are doing, but they are so important, because they help you understanding, the world you live in. So I think I will think about that. Okay, thank you.
So regarding the things, three of the things that am I audible or not? Yeah. So regarding the notions of translation as rewriting. Okay. So thinking of translation in terms of traveling theory that Sahay talked about, how it enshrines traveling of, it's not just the text, but the concepts that are inherent or connoted in the text, travel from one geographical region to another geographical region. The concepts that are read, and I'm talking here in terms of reader's response theory, how the rewriting also occurs in the reader's mind. It doesn't stop at the translator translating the text, but the text is also being rewritten in the reader's mind when the act of reading happens. Also thinking of this in terms of two terms that were introduced by Wimsatt and Beardsley, the affective and intentional fallacy. The translator translating with an effect that sort of may have, you talked about misunderstanding, may lead to a slightly changed translation, and also if he or she assumes the intention of the author, that may also sort of change. So this very act of rewriting,
that's in the field of ideology.
Yes.
It's like what you think that should be done, that should be said. So you are acting in order to promote or stop these things. And you may do it either consciously or unconsciously, of course. I mean,
also, the main point I'm trying to make is that first of all, where does this act of rewriting stop at? Does it stop at the translation, or does it go up to the audience or the reader as well, where they are reading the text?
Well, I was mentioning also, in the system, that's why I introduced the notion of polysystem, when the text is not only a text, that's why culture is there, it's like all these different levels, all different systems that interact each other, among each other. And then, when does this end? I don't know if it ends, because it's a continuous process. And I think the life of a translated text, when does it end? When nobody reads it any longer? I don't know. Yeah, and each and every reader can perceive it in a different way, of course. So I don't think there is one point that we can fix.
Also, with regards to the translation and gender aspect that you discussed, use of certain terms. I'll take example of seminal. We describe text as seminal. I find this very gross, by the way. We are using genitals to describe a text. And then there is a seminal translation as well. Now, these words are very much inherent in academia. They are used with instincts. So, what is the solution to this? Do we sort of...
You will have to ask her.
Do we... Yeah. Do we...
Aren't Jyoti Apki?
So, we use terms like, let's say, seminal in academia very often. Like seminal text, seminal translation. And I also mentioned that I find this word seminal very gross because it uses semen. It comes from semen. So how do we change this? Do we sort of enshrine a oppositional gaze? People are doing it wherein text, Professor mentioned that texts are usually translated when they are referring to both man and woman as he. So do we translate for a she then, for a neutral? People are doing that. We see many universities translating as she. Yes. So do we enshrine an oppositional gaze, or do we sort of hope for a, somebody already mentioned, and maybe Ganga sir mentioned yesterday, said we should hope for a gender neutral pronouns now. So how do we do that? Is oppositional gaze the answer?
I know that Jyoti ji is very active in the discussion about, sexist language.
And before this question is answered, I have one more about post-colonial aspects of post-colonial translation. So, do we think of post-colonial translation as translating back? Now, I am...
Yes, there is, the empire strikes back, there has been this image, striking back. But, okay, this is like an image that has been used, but I don't think that now we should think of post-colonial writing only as writing back to the empire, because as I was saying, I don't think post-colonialism means that there is no colonialism any longer. So maybe it's also writing against something, not writing back to the empire or back, but it's like, addressing this power diversity, power imbalance, and of course writing about it. So if you only think of writing back, I don't know, I think it's like, making it like, okay, you said so, I will say mine, and I will just, discuss what you said. I think there is much more, because as you see, there are many fields that are expanding about that. So I agree, we can think of that as, post-colonial critique as something that writes back to the hegemony of English. But I think we should also distinguish between the hegemony of English in the colonial period and the hegemony of English in the globalized present time. I think there are two different phenomena, and I think capitalism, okay, it's capitalism, but later capitalism, what is going on now in these days is something probably different from what was going on in the 19th century. It is capitalism, but so.
Line of inquiry, I would like to extend the ideas posited by, let's say, Chandra Talpade, Mohanty about under-westernized to translation study perhaps. So when a former colonized translates, are they translating, so to speak, under-westernized? The models they use, the frameworks they use, are they still under-westernized? And similarly, using Salman Rushdie's critique of Commonwealth literature, where he criticizes the idea of Commonwealth literature as something that expects Indian literature to be to exhibit some kind of Indianness. So are we expecting translations from India or from an Indian or from a person of Indian origin to exhibit a sort of Indianness here?
Well, I don't have any. I am not expecting it. I don't know what you are expecting, but I mean, of course, yeah, there is this. If we accept this, that Indianness has to be there, it's not only exotizing, it's also the nationalist approach. Because think of all the notion of Indianness. Nirmal Varma was not Indian enough because he was not writing about India in Vedin. I mean, this is a different kind of Indianness, you know. So I think, well, this is a different kind of thing, you know. It's not related to translation. It's related to fiction, creative writing, I think, what we are talking about. Or are you thinking about, you know, the way we translate this kind of literature?
The kind of models one would use, would that be?
You mean the kind of English that is chosen?
Yeah, English that is chosen, words that is chosen.
Okay, here I would recommend you to read the book Survival. That is the English translation. It was done in the 90s. I can give you the references. I have it here, but it's. Yeah. It was a project from the Sahitya Academy. They wanted a translation of contemporary Hindi poets, and so they made this workshop where poets, translators, and many of them were poets and translators, and Daniel Weisbord. And Harish Trivedi was into this project. He wrote an afterword that I suggest that you read, and then there was like a big debate. I have the article somewhere. It was published by Weisbord as a reply to Trivedi. It was really बहुत चर्चित हुआ. And then, you know, and this is because what happened was that, you know, the translation that was given to Weisbord, then he left to America, and then he, like Harish Trivedi says, he Weisbordized everything. You know, he put his, and then, you know, he was criticizing this because he said, you know, that it was like, you know, putting it in a way that would be what the American or English readers would expect. And then we should also consider that the English reader, if you think of the Indian English reader, is not the American English reader. That's exactly what I wanted to show you in this case, you know, but I don't know, if you want, I can just talk about that in 2 minutes, you know. This is the English translation of a very famous Punjabi novel that was, by the way, commissioned by the Sahitya Academy. So it's an official translation in English, and the novel was translated, and it had, I mean, before this translation, the novel had already had a big success. But then, you know, this is translated into English, and the English, that, of course, then this helps us to consider the notion of, you know, power inequality, because it is located in an isolated area of Punjab, in a village, with people speaking not even standard Punjabi, but, you know, a dialect, and it's translating in the hegemonic language, what, you know, English. So, so how do we translate this non-standard language into English? And the dialogues in English mix a lot of registers because they used archaic insults, for example. That is what happens, for example, very much in Indian English. Indian English uses some forms that are archaic, that people in America and USA, or they don't use them. But they are normal in India, you know, so. And then it uses modern slang of American young people. And then it mixes it with the kind of English that is in some way the English of the working class. And so, and then, you know, I'm not going into details, but it uses these different things. And in the end, we can see that, you know, the translator has made some choices that can be considered good or bad, but the translator had an idea. I want the English reader to have an idea of this kind of non-standard language. How do I do it in English? And, you know, it made it using the urban working class idiom. You can say, how can you make an equivalence between workers and in America and village people in Punjab? But this is the choice that the translator made in order to make the language not so easy, you know, not so standard. And so, of course, this is problematic because, you know, if you are an English speaker Indian reader and you read it and you say, what kind of English is this? So it may be problematic, you know, but this is also a signal. Look, this is a translation. I am the translator and I am showing what I'm doing, you know. So this is an example. I think it's a good example. So I don't know if this is a reply to your.
आपके पहले सवाल के जब मैं आपके लिए बता दूं, 3 किताबों का नाम मैं लेना चाहता हूँ। एक है महावीर प्रसाद द्विवेदी ने 2 किताबों का अनुवाद किया और
ठीक ओके बस।
स्वाधीनता आंदोलन के लिए एक उपकरण के रूप में देखते हैं, लेकिन वह किताब जब इंग्लैंड में लिखी गई तो इंग्लैंड की बदतमीजी के लिए वहाँ के लेखक, वहाँ की जनता की दुर्दशा के लिए, वहाँ के शासकों की जो क्रूरता थी उसके लिए लिखी थी। ऐसे ही आज भी हम ये पंचतंत्र को भारत में बच्चों की किताब के रूप में आज भी देख रहे हैं। लेकिन 8वीं शताब्दी में जब पहलवी के थ्रू ईरान में गया ट्रांसलेट होकर, वहां पर उसे शासकीय उपकरण के रूप में देखा गया, उसे मेटाफर माना कि एक कैसे वहां रूल किया जाता है। तो अनुवाद इस तरह से देशों में भ्रमण करता है। तो हमने कहा कि कौन सा रीडर किस ट्रांसलेशन को पढ़कर क्या समझ लेगा, ये सोचने की बात है। दुष्यंत ने शकुंतला को अंगूठी से पहचानने की चेष्टा की, और वही शकुंतला जब भरत की माँ होगी तो नजारा ही बदल गया।
बहुत धन्यवाद मैम। डॉक्टर ज्योति चावला जी का हम स्वागत करते हैं। उनको चाय ब्रेक के बाद सुनेंगे। हाँ, चाय आपका इंतजार कर रही है, साथ साथ में ढोकला भी है और आज तो काजू कतली भी है।